There is a mythology that exists on the subconscious level of America that when the European first came to this continent, they brought their land with them. They did not. The land was already here, and it belonged to the Indian nations.
And has been shoved off into the dusty, considered to be useless corners of the continent to die out of sight and out of mind. And this is the consummation. So there's no place to back up to. They're talking about potentially contaminating the water supply in a destitute reservation, running it under land that was already illegally taken from these people, which was their best farmland, the most arable land, sacred sites such that are flooded. You got to make a stand somewhere, and this is where.
Lock us up at the gates of hell and we won't back down. We will stand our ground. Why-ya-hi, why-ya-hi.
What is up, you history nuts? Welcome back to The Raging Atheist. I am your boy Nakasuchi, and today I am going to start looking at the American Holocaust. What American Holocaust, you might ask? And the fact that you might ask that question shows you everything wrong with the modern country we live in. In fact, it is America that would provide the playbook for butchers that would come after. Butchers that include Adolf Hitler, who gave a lot of credit to America for his attempt to exterminate Jewish peoples. We gave him and many others the strategy of how to go about it, and the justification that genocide could be something with a little effort that could be forgotten. First, I feel a need to tell you what genocide is. I will use the best definition I can find, but you must understand it is an ever-changing definition as the international world catches up to it. But generally, genocide is the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. Conservative numbers put indigenous peoples on the continent at around 19 million people before the European came. But those are very conservative numbers that most admit are wrong. Numbers based on the myths promoted by Europeans as they promoted the New World as empty lands, yours for the taking. Tribal leaders will tell you these numbers are much greater, that whole civilizations took care of the land that was their God and their birthright. But whatever the real numbers were, these lands were not empty bounties waiting to be tamed. America wasn't a giant, vast wilderness for the white man to come and claim as their own beneath the shrouds of manifest destiny. It was populated with its owners, people that had tended the land for thousands upon thousands of years. And even though, if you want to go with that conservative number, starting with 19 million people, by the year 1970, there were only 260,000 left across the entire continent. Since then, because of the resilience of the native peoples and the great work done by organizations like the American Indian Movement, there are now 6.7 million natives in the United States alone, making up about 2.09% of the modern population. But this doesn't mean that the genocide is finally over, because it isn't. But maybe the tide has finally turned, and these great people can find their place in the modern world at last. I do not know how many videos this series will be, a series that will stand on its own outside of my seasonal content. But I know this video will be a broad look at the genocide, a genocide forgotten by the people that spoil its land to this very day. European and then American governments tried different approaches when it came to the Indian problem. First, they tried subjugation. Then they tried extermination. And when that didn't ultimately work, then came the reservation. Many will attribute the lack of immunity to European diseases as the greatest attribute to the initial genocide, but this is just an effort to take away blame from the European. As noted by historian Jeffrey Osler, quote, when severe epidemics hit, it was less because native bodies lacked immunity for European disease, but because European colonists were taking their resources, causing entire tribes to be subject to malnutrition, starvation, and social stress, all making people more vulnerable to pathogens, end quote. Not to mention the clear intent of the European to use disease as a weapon against the Indian, which they did time and time again. It is a fact that natives welcomed the European to their lands, offered to share their lands and teach them how to tend it. But right from the beginning, the European had proven violent. But still, the people would try friendship, especially as more and more of the European came. They had no way to know that back in Europe, stories of the New World were spreading like wildfire. Great empty lands for any that would go and claim them. Millions came, and then millions more. It would not take long for the Indian peoples to see these new people as invaders. And many natives did come to see the European as invaders. So when the French came, fighting the British in the New World, many tribes sided with the French. They would do so again later, only with the British in the Revolutionary War. Whoever it was that were fighting the colonists that were taking more and more of the land, a lot of the tribes would side with them. Not all of them. Some tribes would side with the colonists. But this would be a costly mistake, as it began the outright demonization of the Indian as barbaric savages that must be destroyed. Not a people that cared about the lands now being trampled upon by the colonists, or their rights as a people that had owned these lands for thousands of years. But the enemy, the redskin. Do you know that the term redskin, the N-word for Indians, doesn't come from them having red skin, but from their bloody scalps? It had been French fur traders scalping Indians that had started that ghastly practice. After the revolution, with the new government needing more and more land, they started to persecute those tribes that sided with their enemies, first the French and then the British. Just outright taking land, killing them, killing their women and children, even their elders. And they needed more land because more and more were coming from Europe. Bibles in one hand, a gun in the other. Andrew Jackson would run and win on a campaign of hatred of the Indian, a platform of removal. The American government wanted all land east of the Mississippi. They had started this process of acquiring land from natives through treaty well before Jackson. But to Andrew Jackson, the treaty process was too slow. Most have heard of the Trail of Tears. That trail had been made famous, the walk of genocide from Cherokee, what is now Tennessee, Georgia, and North Carolina, all the way to Oklahoma. But there were many trails, as the Indian was only offered two choices. Move west, give up your lands but keep your sovereignty, or assimilate and become as the white man. I will be going into great detail in coming videos on the removal and on Andrew Jackson, whom I consider to be the worst president this nation has ever had. The greedy and corrupt practices of the Americans, with their treaties that became known as quote-unquote bad paper. Conflicts erupted. As I go through this series, and I'm going to take my time with it, I will detail some of these conflicts. Massacres, really. Many times, in conversations with Christians, they always bring up the atrocities of Hitler, or of Stalin, or Mao. I have often been asked, what atrocities have Christians ever committed? I usually reply with the witch trials, the slaughter of the heathens, or sometimes I'll even point to the failure of America's healthcare system. But here is the biggest atrocity. Under the guise of manifest destiny, the belief that God had given these lands to the colonists, the Holocaust of the land's indigenous peoples began, and it continues to this very day. I, for one, will never forget it, and I will do all I can to make sure it isn't forgotten. So I will be seeing you guys very soon.